Well, good to see everybody again. This is going to be our lecture on chapter 21. Therefore, this is the last chapter that we will be dealing with for the first section of the course. So the final bit of material that will be covered in your first test. And you should have already seen the video lecture on the test and received the email on that. If you have not, then you need to go ahead and get a hold of me and make sure that I get that to you. Time is very, very short at this point. So we have spent all of our time in the class thus far talking about what's been going on inside the United States. In other words, we've been talking mainly about domestic affairs, economic, political, cultural. Now we are going to turn our attention more or less outward and look at America's rise, or at least the beginning of its rise as a world power. And this is something that most Americans would have never anticipated, at least not in a economic and a military sense, necessarily, certainly not in a political and diplomatic sense. Remember that the United States was born out of revolution against a colonial power, against an empire. We had won our independence from the British, and ever since then had looked askew, had looked with disfavor upon the great powers of the world running around, forming colonies and that sort of thing. We believe ourselves better than that. We believed ourselves above all of that. And this is a place where, perception is reality to a certain extent. That there's a reality here that the United States, like those European powers, the British, the French, the Belgians, the Russians, were expanding during the 18th and the 19th century. It's just that the United States was expanding into territory on its own continent, next to its own borders, territory that we had purchased. In the case of Louisiana, territory that we had negotiated for. In the case of Florida and the Pacific Northwest, territory that we had won by war. In the case of Texas, the Southwest, and California. So expansion across the North American continent was qualitatively different in some ways, and in other ways not, when we compared it to what the great powers were doing in Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. If you ask a Sioux Indian, what was happening to him in 1876, and you ask a Zulu warrior in South Africa the same question, what was happening to him in 1876, the story would have been pretty much the same. But when you settle your own territory, that's different than going beyond your borders and taking territory. Colonizing is different than settle. In important ways, although in some ways that it's not. But nonetheless, Americans had always looked at colonial efforts, imperial expansion is something that they were not really interested in. But that is going to change as we get to the end of the 19th century. It's going to change reluctantly. It's going to change slowly at first. We're going to see an evolution of Americans being relatively ambivalent, if not outright hostile to overseas expansion, to beginning to consider it, then suddenly doing it in a rush as a result of foreign war. And one of the turning points, of course, in all of this is America's great rise as an industrial power. So here's a place where the Second Industrial Revolution is going to have a profound impact on America's foreign policy, America's place in the world. In 1870, the United States, really kind of at the start of the Second Industrial Revolution, had exported $393 million worth of goods. 20 years later, in 1890, we were exporting $858 million worth of goods, and just 8 years later, in 1898, the United States became something that it had never been before. It became a net exporter, which means we exported more to the world than we brought in from it, and that was something that the United States would continue to be until the 1960s. By the time you think 1900, the monetary value of American overseas exports had climbed to $1.4 billion. That's billion with a B. So in 1898, $858 million, and 2 years later, $1.4 billion. And of course, all of this overseas trade was critical to America's domestic prosperity. It was critical to Americans having jobs and social mobility and these sorts of things. So this overseas trade was becoming vitally important to everyday Americans in their everyday lives. And of course, overseas trade brought with it overseas complications. That we were still in a world that was run by, in large part, kings, queens, czars, emperors in the second half of the 19th century, going into the first part of the 20th century. England, France, Germany, Belgium, Russia were all engaged in a race for empire, what they called the Great Game, competing with each other for colonies and the resources and the markets of colonies and the military advantage of colonies, and working to block one another off from getting those advantages. And it was a world where the concept of international law was very new, where might still made right, where if you wanted to guarantee that you had access to foreign markets, if you needed raw materials from overseas, you had access to those, you had better be able to defend your trade militarily. And so this economic revolution in the United States is going to forcibly make Americans confront the question of their place in the world, their role in the world, and to come to realize that they were going to have to defend their interest in the world, not just their economic interest, of course, but the United States still considered itself to be basically a revolutionary nation. We were one of the few outright democracies that existed, and we believed that wherever we went, we would take the flag and the Bill of Rights and the Constitution with us, the ideas enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, and that was one of the American exports as well. And one of the reasons that in 1823, President James Monroe had issued the Monroe Doctrine that warned European powers against trying to create new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. We cheered every time a former Spanish or Portuguese colony threw off the yoke of its master and became independent. We were in favor of all those things, and we were not going to let the European powers come over here and found additional colonies. The Western Hemisphere was going to be colony-free, and if there was going to be a dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, it was, of course, going to be the United States. But none of this, of course, was going to quickly rise into the consciousness of the American people. The Second Industrial Revolution was bringing all sorts of problems and opportunities of its own. We were in the final throes of settling the West. There was political turmoil and labor unrest and these sorts of things. Those did a much better job of grabbing the headlines, of captivating people's attention. And so the growth in America's overseas trade and the concerns, the complications, the requirements that went along with that were not something that was recognized by most people. Of course, financiers and diplomats and these kinds of people saw it, but that wasn't enough to convince the American people that the time perhaps was coming when they were going to have to take a more active part in world affairs. The event that perhaps helped to swing Americans in that direction was something more profound, as something that came as an unexpected shock as a consequence of the census of 1890. So one of the things that's required in the U.S. Constitution is every 10 years we physically count the number of people in every state. And this is done primarily to apportion representation in the House of Representatives, the lower branch of the Congress, and that, of course, impacts the electoral vote that every other state has, or every state gets. But by the time that you get to the 1890s, the census has become more than that. The census has also become an opportunity for people in new career fields like professional historians and demographers and ethnologists and this sort of stuff to gather data about the American people. Not just where did they live, how much money do they have, what kind of jobs do they have, these sorts of things. So the census was going to be telling us more about our country than just how many people lived in each of its various states. And one of the things that the census of 1890 did came as a great shock to the American people, and that was the announcement that there was no longer, quote, a discernible frontier line, unquote. The census of 1890, in other words, says that the American frontier is gone. There were, of course, still wilderness areas. There were places that people had not settled or had barely traveled over, but most of the land was spoken for in one way or another. And certainly you could no longer go to a map and draw a bunch of dots and put a line between them and say, okay, this is the frontier. And so from here back, we have civilization, and from here forward, we have nature, we have a lack of law and order, we have the unknown. That had always been part of the American experience. From the moment the first English colonists set foot at Jamestown and later at Plymouth Rock, there had always been a frontier. And because there had always been a frontier, America had constantly been growing, expanding into that frontier. There had always been a place for people to go and seek adventure, to test themselves, to get a fresh start, to find new resources and develop new ways of making a living and making money, or people just wanted to get away from the crowding in the cities and be someplace where there were fewer people. That had always been there for Americans. But suddenly, in 1890, officially, it was gone. And it's not like people hadn't seen it coming. I mean, remember the Oklahoma land rush? I mean, literally, here's the last of the free land to get in the West, and we have this great rush of people in there. We'd kind of seen the end of the frontier coming, right? But we were still surprised when it happened. And this is a very human thing. We know there are certain things in life that are inevitable. We know that it's inevitable, all other things being equal, that our parents will probably die before we do. That is a biological fact, but it's an unpleasant thing to think about. You don't know exactly how or when it's going to happen, and you can't do anything about it until those moments are upon you. But mentally you know at some point this is something that you're going to have to cope with, but physically, emotionally, you don't really have to confront it until it actually happens. So sort of knowing in the back of your head, this is part of the future is one thing, and then suddenly that future being the present is something very different. And that is basically what happened to the American people. And this was a shock. It was a shock. And everybody sensed that the end of the frontier couldn't be a good thing, right? I mean, it always seems like a bad deal when something you've always had access to, something that's always been there for you, suddenly is not. We don't like that. Even if it's something that we weren't enjoying, something that we weren't using, we always have that option, right? And suddenly the option is gone, and that tends to make us uncomfortable. And so the end of the frontier was something that Americans instinctively understood couldn't be a good thing, but they really weren't able to tell you why. And so there was this vague sense of unease about what the end of the frontier meant, but it didn't have to exist for long, because in 1893, a man named Frederick Jackson Turner kind of told the American people why the end of the frontier made them so uneasy. And Frederick Jackson Turner was a professional historian. This is one of the things the Second Industrial Revolution does is vastly expand colleges and universities. It leads you to public schooling, and it leads to the rise of professionalism in a whole bunch of fields. And one of the new professions was in the social sciences. sciences, and one of the social sciences was the field of historian. And historians are people who are actually trained to examine the past, to look at the past, to find evidence, to collate it, to collect it, to analyze it in an objective way, to try and see patterns and lessons in the past and apply them to the present, or help them become useful tools for the present and in building the future. And so Turner was one of these new professionals, a professional historian, and he was probably the first professional historian who was really going to have a big impact on American culture, the American psyche. And he did that by writing a pamphlet called The Frontier Thesis of American History, sometimes known as the Pioneer Thesis of American History. And what that pamphlet did was to explain to the American people why the frontier had been so important in American history. And basically, Turner's thesis boils down to the frontier having provided Americans with essential elements of our national identity and culture, as well as our economic well-being. So first off, Turner says that the frontier was responsible for American prosperity. Frontier was responsible for American prosperity. And why? Because, well, expansion physically means expansion economically. It means new markets, it means new resources, it means the need to build and to construct, and all of that spurs economic activity. So it creates wealth and it produces wealth. And so with the frontier, it had always been key to our economic prosperity. Next, Turner says the frontier was responsible for America's social stability. The United States seemed like a particularly stable society, a particularly stable government. We didn't have rebellions and revolutions and coups and that sort of thing like you saw in so many other places in the world. And why was that? Was it because America was a perfect place? No. It was because the frontier had been a safety release valve. So when people got fed up with the way things were, if they felt there was no opportunity, if they felt that they were being mistreated, they could pick up and they could go west. They could go where the strictures of established society were not there to burden them. They could go someplace where they could get a fresh economic start, where they could get in on the ground floor and help make new laws and structure new governments that would be more to their liking. And so this had relieved the pressure and things back east. And people had an option rather than trying to overthrow the government or topple the economy or something like that. And then lastly, Turner argues that the frontier was responsible for the American spirit, that unique American spirit, this idea of can-do, rugged individualism, God, country, freedom, all of that grew on the frontier and was sustained by the frontier, because these were traits that you had to have to survive, to succeed on the frontier. On the frontier, you were on your own. You had to take care of yourself. You had to not do it all alone. You couldn't rely on anybody else. You certainly couldn't holler for the government to come and to assist you. You were out there alone, maybe with your family or a few other people, relying on your own talents, your own perseverance, your own hard work, and the blessings of God to live and to succeed. And the frontier had fostered that and had kept it alive, even as more and more of the country had become settled and pacified in natural terms. And so what Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis argues is that the frontier was critical to American prosperity, it was critical to America's social stability, and it was critical to America's unique spirit. And he didn't go any further than that. He said, this is my thesis, this is what I think, and my first look at the evidence, these are my conclusions. He didn't offer a whole bunch of proof. These were not fully developed theories, but when he published them, they were wildly popular because the American people read them and they heard about them, and they basically said, that's it, that's it. This is why the end of the frontier is a bad thing. It was sort of like, have you ever tried to remember the name of a song or an actor or something like that? You can't get it, you can't get it, you can't get it, and it's driving you crazy. And then somebody says, oh, that song's called this. And you're like, oh my gosh, yes, there it is. Thank you so much. This is basically what Frederick Jackson Turner had done for the American people. And of course, the American people instinctively believed what he said. It seemed to make so much sense. It was a wildly popular idea. The pamphlet sold very well, so some publishers gave Turner a lot of money as an advance and asked him to write the book that would prove the thesis. He took the money, and he never got around to writing the book. In fact, he died before he could write the book, and the reason for that was because he probably couldn't prove the thesis. That the theory sounded good, but when you got down and you looked at the facts, they didn't really pan out. If you look at the frontier as a source of America's economic prosperity, well, it plays a role, but the real engines of America's economic prosperity were really found in the settled parts of the country. The rise of mass production tobacco and cotton in the settled parts of the South and the West, the rise of ports and cities and the Industrial Revolution back in the East. The frontier had helped to feed those things, raw material. They had been a market for those, the products there, but they had not been the primary market by any stretch of the imagination, and they hadn't been the primary source of raw material either. And so that really doesn't hold up. The frontier is a factor, but it is not the factor, which is what Turner has suggested. When you argue that the frontier was a safety release valve, well, that doesn't really stand up to scrutiny either, because the idea is here that the unlucky, the unfortunate, the people who feel oppressed, the people who are at the bottom of the social economic ladder who want to get a fresh start, they're the ones who are fed up and frustrated and who need to escape the East and the establishment and the economy in which they already exist and go west and get that fresh start. And the difficulty with that is, first off, that unless you lived very close to the frontier already, that was not something that the most unfortunate, the poorest people, the most downtrodden people in America could do, for the simple reason that going west cost money. You've heard that old adage, you have to have money to make money. It's very hard to just start a business. You got to get investors. You got to get a loan, right? No matter how good your idea is, you got to have some money to get going. And the same thing with moving west. You had to get there. You had to get wagons, mules, oxen, buy the railway ticket. When you got there, you had to purchase land, even if it was at cheap government prices. You had to have tools. You had to have supplies, plows, seed, livestock, these sorts of things. And so the people who tended to move west were the 19th century equivalent of what today we would call middle class, people that were doing fairly well, who had some resources, who thought they could do better. Those are the people who went west, and so these were not the people who were inclined to be frustrated and fed up with the way things were back east. They were the people that were doing fairly well back east. And so the idea that this is a safety release valve really doesn't pan out, nor does the concept that America was somehow a uniquely stable society, because if you look at our politics, they were certainly not stable. There was a lot of back and forth, a lot of arguing in the lead up to the Civil War. There was, of course, the Civil War itself. The country split apart. We went to war with ourselves. We wiped out 2% of our population, killed 620,000 people. That does not speak to a uniquely stable economic, social, and political system. And let's don't forget all that labor unrest in the second half of the 19th century. So if you look at the evidence, that part of Turner's thesis doesn't work out, which leads us to the final component of the thesis, which that somehow the frontier is responsible for American spirit, the American spirit. And here Turner's, I think, on a little bit firmer ground, because certainly his argument that the spirit of can-do individualism, rugged individualism, don't expect help, don't rely on the government, that is true. You need that to survive on a frontier, and in the beginning, the country had been nothing but a frontier, and so those traits had certainly been planted and fostered in the American experience, and then they continued to live on the frontier. Absolutely, that is all true. But what Turner's thesis overlooks is that American spirit existed everywhere in the country. It didn't just exist on a frontier or close to the frontier or in a sector that had only recently stopped being a frontier. That spirit existed back along the Atlantic seaboard amongst the people of the 13 the states that had been the original 13 colonies. They embraced those same ideas, that same American spirit, even though they had not been the frontier for a couple hundred years. And so this is a case of twigs bent, trees grow. This is something that had become part of the American character in the very beginning, and it's traits that Americans had come to value, and they passed them along generation after generation after generation. They were as utilitarian back east as they were on the frontier, and so the end of the frontier didn't mean that American spirit was going to evaporate. So Turner's arguments don't hold up. So it's a good thing he never tried to write the book. He couldn't have proven his case, but that didn't matter, because people heard the thesis, believed the thesis, it made sense to them, and they didn't go looking for the book. Nobody, kind of poked their head up a decade later and say, hey, that Turner guy and that thesis, did he ever write the book to prove that? Does that mean that this thesis is wrong? No. It's just like when a newspaper or a website or a TV news program, gets a story wrong. And they put it out there, and here's the first blush of the story, and it's what everybody hears, and maybe it's shocking or it's disconcerting, and that becomes what people believe, and then it turns out that that's not the case. And they come back days or weeks later, and they print retractions, and they make corrections. Everybody sees the initial headline. Not that many people wind up seeing the retraction. And so you've sort of planted this idea in people's heads. They've embraced it, accepted it, and they don't go looking to have something that they've come to believe overturned. And so the frontier thesis, or if you prefer the pioneer thesis of American history, is very much like that. And so Americans believe that the end of the frontier was a very, very bad thing. Our prosperity was now at risk. Our social stability was at risk. The American spirit was at risk. And since these were all things we valued, we didn't want to lose them. And if you weren't going to lose them, and they relied on a frontier to sustain them, and there was no longer a frontier on the North American continent, what were you going to do? And the answer, of course, is you were going to have to find a new frontier. You have to find a new frontier. People were not thinking in terms of frontiers of science or medicines. Frontiers under the sea, of course, were unreachable. The frontier of space that Captain Kirk and Picard talk about all the time, that wasn't available to people. Frontier was a physical thing. It was a place where you could go, where you could put down roots, where you could build and experience. And so the frontier meant literal frontier. And if you weren't going to be able to find that frontier on the North American continent, then you were going to have to go elsewhere to find it, and that means going overseas. Now, going overseas was, of course, something that Americans had never had to do, never had to think about, although there were musing rumblings about, we ought to have Cuba and that kind of sort of thing early on, but they'd never really taken hold in the American psyche. But now we're going to have to change our mind, and changing our mind was going to be reluctant. It's not like the United States had not toyed with expansion overseas. In 1867, we had annexed the Midway Islands. The Midway Islands are about 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii. They're almost midway in the Pacific, hence the name. If you're going from the west coast to Japan, they're two little fly specks. They have no resources except their dry land, two islands encircling the lagoon. There are no inhabitants, but the Midway Islands were a useful stopping point for ships crossing the Atlantic. That lagoon was someplace you could put into if there was a storm or you had to make repairs or something like that. And so we annexed the Midway Islands. We went, plunked our flag on them, said they belonged to us, and the response of the American people was to not even notice. Nobody had ever heard of the Midway Islands. You look at a map, they probably weren't there in the second half of the 19th century. Of course, in 1942, the Midway Islands would be a vital outpost to Hawaii. One of the greatest naval battles in history would be fought for control of Midway Island, the Battle of Midway in June of 42, and it would be a battle that helped to turn the tide of the Pacific War against the Japanese. But that's very far in the future, in 1867. And so here's one example of America's attitude toward overseas expansion before the census of 1890, and that was ambivalence. We don't care. Don't even notice. The other piece of territory we got, though, in 1867 provoked very different reactions, and that was the purchase of Alaska. So Alaska belonged to the Russian Empire, and the Russian Empire was one of the few European countries that was overtly friendly to the United States. During our Civil War, England and France were pro-Confederate. The Russian Empire was pro-Union, mostly because it was anti-England and France. Russia had emancipated its serfs in the same year that we had emancipated our slaves. And the United States, of course, is always uncomfortable with the idea of European powers owning territory in the Western Hemisphere. And in 1867, Russia had found itself in a very serious economic plight. Alaska had very few settlers, and it had very few resources except fishing and whaling off of its coast. And so the Russians had offered to sell Alaska to the United States. And the Secretary of State at the time, William Seward, had convinced then President Andrew Johnson that this was a good idea, and they prevailed upon Congress to do it, mainly as a way to get the Russians out of the Western Hemisphere. And so we had purchased Alaska. And even today, we know that Alaska is not part of the contiguous United States. It's remote, and of course, it's for all of its majesty, it's cold, and it's a harsh climate with a short winter. And you know, at the time we purchased it, everybody was basically astounded. We spent how much for that? Thomas Nast drew a cartoon showing the first senators from a supposed state of Alaska coming to Washington, D.C., and one was an Eskimo and the other was a penguin. Well, there are no penguins in Alaska. They're from Antarctica, but the point was made. This was considered ridiculous. We spent a lot of money for no good reason to buy basically a frozen wasteland, and it was referred to as Seward's folly. And so here's another example of American attitudes toward overseas expansion, and that's outright hostility. For God's sake, why would we want this kind of territory? Now, of course, in the future, we discover gold in Alaska in the 1890s, then we discover oil in Alaska. All of those things become very, very important. You can imagine that if Russia had continued to own Alaska, and then you get the Russian Revolution, so Alaska is owned by the Soviet Union, and then you have the Cold War, that phrase might have taken on a very different meaning in the second half of the 20th century. But just like the Battle of Midway, that's all in the future. At the time that the purchase was made in 1867, this was considered to be a waste of money. This was a ridiculous thing to do. But after the census of 1890, Americans begin to come around. We begin to come around. And in fact, we'd already kind of started to drift in that direction with an interest in the Hawaiian Islands. In Hawaii, the 8 islands of the Hawaiian chain are large, they are beautiful, and there's arable land in Hawaii, but it had on the island of Oahu a natural harbor called Pearl Harbor, which was an excellent anchorage for ships. Hawaii is known as the crossroads of the Pacific, and that's a literal phrase because ships going across the Pacific, whether they're going east or going west, are probably going to stop at some point at Hawaii. And so Hawaii was a place that was strategically located. And in the 1820s, American missionaries had begun to go there. Missionaries always tended to be the first wave of Europeans or Americans who would go to a new territory. They would begin to convert people to Christianity and that sort of stuff. And these missionaries were welcomed by the Hawaiians for the most part. They settled, they got along well with the population, and they wrote letters home talking about how beautiful this place was, what a great business opportunity it was. And so more and more Americans began to move to Hawaii and to put down roots, and they prospered and they did very well. Hawaii, of course, was populated already by Hawaiians, and they lived under a monarchy and were an independent country. So whenever you hear we Texans brag about the fact that we're the only state in the Union that was ever its own nation, that is not true. Hawaii was its own country, and it was its own country for far longer than Texas was. Texas only its own country for 10 years. Hawaii was an independent country for hundreds of years. But the Americans who came in did very well, and they began to develop the island's economy, and they developed it around sugar cane. Sugar becomes the principal export of Hawaii, and that trade is centered on the United States. We are closer to Hawaii than anybody else, and so it only made sense. So Hawaiian sugar was flowing to the U.S. West Coast, and we were sending manufactured goods and other foodstuffs to Hawaii. In 1875, we signed a reciprocity agreement with the Hawaiian government to let their sugar enter the U.S. tariff-free, and American goods come into Hawaii tariff-free. This made Hawaii even more economically dependent upon the United States, and the relationship went very well. In 1887, the Hawaiian government gave the U.S. Exclusive use of Pearl Harbor, and this was very, very important because America's growing overseas trade necessitated the growth of American military power. So for most of our history, we had very few enemies. Canada, we had fought in the War of 1812 and in our Revolution. Mexico, we'd fought in the Mexican-American War, but after that, our neighbors, were no problem by and large, and so we'd always had a very small army. Our Navy had been geared mostly toward coastal defense, and with a handful of ships capable of selling the world, looking out for American interests, and that sort of thing. But once you got to the point where you were a net exporter, then protecting that overseas trade, protecting Americans engaged in overseas trade was more important than ever before because like I said, there was no international law. The way that you made sure that Americans were not attacked, that they were not mistreated, that they were not denied access to markets, that their shipping wasn't harassed, that their goods weren't taken or confiscated, was to have military power. And military power meant an American Navy. Of course, the difficulty with that was that the American Navy was very small. In 1880, we had just 48 warships, and they were not technologically advanced. Although U.S. during the Civil War had become one of the greatest navies in the world, we had pioneered things like the naval torpedo and the submarine and the revolving gun turret and the ironclad warship. all that naval technology was expensive, and after the Civil War, we went back to wooden sailing ships, while the rest of the world, the rest of the world's great powers, were embracing the technological evolution that we had unleashed in our war between the states, and constantly modernizing and improving their navies. And of course, this made the United States militarily weak, incapable of protecting our overseas trade and our overseas interest. And that disturbed an admiral and a professor in the U.S. Naval War College named Alfred Thayer Mahan. Alfred Thayer Mahan. And in 1890, he released a book that would be as influential as Turner's frontier thesis. So this comes out 3 years before Turner's thesis, but the same year as that troublesome census in 1890. And that book was called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. The Influence of Sea Power Upon History is a long history of naval warfare and naval powers. And Mahan's argument was that all great powers in world history have been great naval powers because they have been great seaborne trading powers. They've been great maritime powers. And that was certainly the case for the United States. We had three coasts: the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Gulf. And more of our prosperity was based on overseas trade, and that trade had to be protected in a hostile world. And if we were going to protect that trade, then we needed to have a modern navy, a large navy, a technologically sophisticated navy, and a navy that was built not to protect our coastline, not to simply raid enemy commerce in time of war in a form of sort of guerrilla warfare on the high seas, which were the traditional American naval strategies. No, what Mahan says is we need a navy that is capable of controlling the seas. So not only do we need a new modern navy to protect our overseas trade and thus our prosperity, that navy needs a new modern mission, and that is to control the seas. And how do you control the seas? Well, obviously you do that by controlling the shipping lanes. So if you look at a map of the world, you see that it's mostly water, and these vast amounts of water seem trackless, but in fact they're not. Remember that the quickest way to get from point A to point B is along a direct line, and that means that the ocean actually has invisible roads, and those roads are shipping lanes, and they have choke points that are straits and narrows and this sort of stuff. And so if you want to control the seas, you have a navy that's capable of going and sitting on those shipping lanes or sitting at those choke points and physically controlling them, making sure that your ships can go through them without being harassed in time of war, preventing enemy ships from being able to do that. And so Mahan made the case. The Congress listened and began to build up the American Navy and modernize the American Navy. But the implications of the Second Industrial Revolution and the census of 1890 and Turner's thesis, of course, made this naval expansion even more important. But of course, this also points toward territorial expansion, because ships, both civilian and military, the second half of the 19th century, the dawn of the 20th, were powered by coal. Powered by coal. There were still some sailing ships around, but we're talking about real modern commerce and certainly real naval power. Then your ships are fueled with coal. And coal is heavy and it's bulky. It is difficult to transfer from one ship to another while you're actually out on the high seas. And because ships burned coal and needed to replenish those supplies, no navy could simply start on the west coast of the United States and sail straight across the Pacific Ocean. That was not something that was possible. So really what you did, if you wanted to project naval power, was to hopscotch from coaling station to coaling station to coaling station to coaling station, in the same way that if you were to drive across the United States, you just don't get in your car and start driving. You actually hopscotch from gas station to gas station to gas station to gas station, right? And although you could potentially buy coal, from other countries, a whole host of places. In wartime, you could not count on that. In wartime, if a country declared itself neutral, your warships would not be allowed to enter their harbors. Or if you were fighting that country, obviously you don't get access to their coaling stations and their harbors. So the only way that you could reliably project American naval power was to have American coaling stations located in strategic places on American soil, and that meant territorial expansion. And getting exclusive rights to Pearl Harbor was a big plus for the Navy because ships could get from, say, San Francisco or San Diego to Pearl Harbor, and that extended American naval power not all the way across the Pacific, but deeper into the Pacific than ever before. And so Hawaii was important to us. It was economically useful, and it was militarily useful, which means that it was also useful in protecting our growing overseas trade. But then the situation with Hawaii began to get a little bit problematic. The king with whom we had such good relations for so long died. His daughter took the throne, and she was not so keen on the dominance of Americans in the Hawaiian Islands. So many Americans had moved to Hawaii, had put down roots, had become pillars of the business community. They really did kind of control the economy, and the Queen believed that they had too much influence, they had too much power. She thought that Hawaii should be run by the Hawaiians for the interest of the Hawaiians, and so she decreed a new constitution, trying to lessen the power of all of these Americans who had moved there and give more of that power to the native people. And that did not go over well. In shades of the Texas Revolution, all these Americans had moved into Texas, which was part of Mexico. They had agreed to live under the Mexican Constitution. They had prospered under that Constitution. They believed they had upheld their end of the bargain, but the government in Mexico began to become nervous. There are too many of them, and they've got too much control, and so General Santa Anna, who was the president of Mexico at the time, had decreed a new constitution, and all these Americans said, no, you can't just decree a new constitution. A constitution is a sacrosanct thing. No king or president or monarch or queen can simply come in and say, oh, the old constitution's gone, new constitution's in its place. That does not compute in the American psyche. And so the American business leaders in Hawaii, on the big island of Hawaii and Oahu, revolted in early 1893, and they arrested the Queen and imprisoned her in her own palace. And they were received sympathetically by the American minister to Hawaii, the American diplomatic representative to Hawaii, John L. Stevens, who supported this revolution, this rebellion, if you will, by convincing the captain of the cruiser USS Boston, which was anchored in Pearl Harbor, to send 150 Marines ashore to protect American interest. The Hawaiian military, such as it was prepared to fight, but the Queen declined to send them in the battle. She wasn't going to let bloodshed happen, and so within 3 days, her government had been overthrown. The rebellion had bloodlessly succeeded, and the Americans set up a provisional government, and on February 14th, 1893, they signed a treaty with Minister Stevens annexing Hawaii to the United States. And so that seemed to be a done deal, but it wasn't, because treaties have to be ratified by a 2/3 majority vote of the Senate, and the president has to submit those treaties to the Senate. And in February of 1893, we were in the closing weeks of the administration of Benjamin Harrison. He only had 2 weeks left, and he wanted to do this. He sent the treaty to the Senate, but the Senate refused to ratify it. And when Grover Cleveland came in to take his second shot at being president, he withdrew the treaty. He was horrified by what had happened in Hawaii, and and demanded that the American expatriates there restore the monarchy, put the Queen back on her throne. But of course, the American expatriates, who believe themselves to be as Hawaiian, as native Hawaiian islanders, refused. If the United States did not want to annex Hawaii, then Hawaii would become an independent republic. And so sort of shades of Texas again. After we won our independence from Mexico, we wanted to be annexed by the United States. The outgoing president at the time, Andrew Jackson, was in favor, but the incoming president, Martin Van Buren, was not. And so Texas had been rebuffed and wound up becoming an independent republic. The same thing now happens with Hawaii. So Hawaii is not going to be annexed. We're going to continue our economic ties with Hawaii. We still have exclusive use to Pearl Harbor, and more Americans would go to Hawaii. But here's the interesting thing about the Hawaiian story as far as the tale that we are pursuing. How did Americans respond to all of this? And we found the country divided, almost evenly divided. Half the country thought that Cleveland had been right in refusing to annex Hawaii, and the other half thought that he had been very, very wrong. So look at it this way. In 1867, with the annexation of Midway and the purchase of Alaska, Americans had shown that they were ambivalent or hostile to overseas expansion. By the time that you get to the 1893 period in this business with Hawaii, the country's evenly split. So the tide of public opinion is absolutely shifting. America is poking around in other places. The Samoan Islands, which are on the way to Australia, were something that America became involved in and got agreements to that allowed us to have trading rights and treaty rights there. We're beginning to flex our muscle. We're beginning to flex our muscle. And more Americans are coming to accept that our prosperity relies on overseas expansion. More and more Americans are becoming to accept the idea that overseas expansion is how we're going to not only maintain our prosperity, but our social stability and the American spirit. We're coming around. We're coming around to the idea. One of the things that you have to do here, though, if you're going to make that kind of change, is you're going to have to justify it to yourself. If you've always said, no, colonies are something America will never have, overseas expansion is something America does not want, America does not need, and suddenly you're going to conclude that no, maybe we are going to have colonies. It's in our self-interest, and we are going to have to expand overseas. We're sort of being forced into it by economic, military, and diplomatic circumstances. That's still a sea change. And you don't want to be so crass, and especially with Americans, you don't want to be so crass to say, well, realpolitik, we have to do these things. This is the way the world works, and we need to accept that that's the way the world works. And so Americans needed some additional justifications. Unfortunately, there were justifications that were drifting around out there. Concepts like social Darwinism, which took Charles Darwin's scientific theory of the evolution of species and put it on human civilizations. Darwin says that in evolution, the strong survive. The more adapt critters or plants or whatever are the ones who are going to get food, and the ones who are going to reproduce, and therefore they're going to thrive. And those who do not compete as well will not get the food, will not reproduce, and will die. And that this is the way that nature works, and this is the way that species evolve. And social Darwinism says, well, the same sort of thing then for human civilizations. There's some civilizations that are more evolved than others, that are better adapted to survive. And by civilization, we're talking about basically social organization, not culture. Culture is part of civilization, but not civilization itself. So what's the purpose of civilization? Well, social Darwinism would tell you that civilizations exist to defend, to house, to feed, to clothe, and to care for, to educate their citizens. And some civilizations are better at doing this than others. And if you looked around the world, you could absolutely say that. There are countries that are more prosperous, countries that are militarily stronger, countries that are more technologically advanced, countries that don't have famines and these sorts of things, countries with growing populations and scientific and educational achievements and these sorts of things. And those are the superior countries. And these are the ones that are destined to take control, to govern the world. Of course, that seems a little bit harsh, and for Americans a bit too harsh. And so we had to modify it with ideas like the white man's burden, that we were not simply going to have the superior cultures, the superior civilizations, overrun the inferior ones and help them become extinct. And remember that it just so happened that where you found the richest countries, the most technologically advanced countries, the countries with the greatest scientific attainments and all that kind of stuff, tended to be in the northern hemisphere, which means the U.S., Canada, it's Europe, it's Russia, it's in these sorts of places, and this fit in very nicely with racial stereotypes, racial beliefs that scientists were eager to confirm that whites were at the top of the evolutionary ladder, and below them you would have the other races, yellow and brown, and then black and red, and this sort of stuff. Ideas that to us today seem absolutely preposterous, but at the time were articles of faith. Races had always judged each other in this way, and there were times when the races of the Middle East were at the top of the heap, and the races of Asia were at the top of the heap, and they perceived other peoples to be lesser than themselves. This is unfortunately the way that human beings have thought for most of their existence, but at this point in time, it was the predominantly white countries of the Northern Hemisphere that were on top of the economic military ladder and therefore perceived to be superior. But by the 19th century, the 20th century, the idea that you could just go in and simply take what you wanted and take over had to be tempered. It didn't mean you weren't going to do it necessarily, especially if you're one of the great European empires, but you have to temper it. And so the idea of the white man's burden comes along, that it is the responsibility of the superior race to go in and to protect the inferior races, to help move them up the evolutionary ladder faster than they would absolutely go, and to mentor them, so to speak, and help them along. And this, of course, by modern standards, is a very condescending attitude, but at the time, it was considered to be a very compassionate attitude. This is something new that had never become part of the international psyche before. And the white man's burden means that the superior race, the superior culture has a responsibility to care for, to protect, to educate, to uplift. And of course, that's going to take a very long time. It's going to be a lot of hard work. It's going to be very expensive. So it's only fair that while that's happening, we're going to run the show. We're going to run the economy so that we can make sure that this gets done and that we can pay for doing this. So in some ways, it's sort of self-serving philosophy, but it was widely believed to be a compassionate philosophy as well. And so you could look at things like social Darwinism that says, look, it's inevitable. The strong take over, the weak disappear. That's the way it is nature. Why isn't it that way amongst human civilizations? And so if you want a justification for overseas expansion, you can say, well, there it is. It's science. The guys in the lab coats and with the blackboards are saying painted, and so you can't question that. But if you found that to be a little bit too harsh, a little too cruel, if you thought that that ran against your Christian ethic, then you could argue that, well, we're not just doing that. We're going into these places, we're going to run them for a while, but we're going to help these people along, we're going to lift them up, we're going to make things better. And then Americans could add to that. Americans could add to the idea that we're bringing the Constitution, the idea of government by the consent of the governed with us wherever we go. These American philosophies of individual liberty and rights and these sorts of things, even if we did not fully apply them in our own country to everybody, and we certainly did not at that point in time, these were the American ideas. These were the things that Americans held themselves up to. The Americans were even then struggling with trying to live up to, which is kind of the story of our whole country for its entire existence, working and working and working, to try and live up to the principles that Jefferson put into the Declaration of Independence that we enshrine in our Bill of Rights. And sometimes it's one step forward and two back, but America's always been moving in that constant direction, and those who are able to step back and take a glance at the scope of history will realize that American progress has been remarkably fast, if imperfect, compared to the way human beings have run their show for most of their existence. And so Americans could convince themselves that what they were doing was going to benefit other people and not just ourselves. And you could argue, and some did, that that was self-delusional, that was just self-justification, but nonetheless it was one of those things. And so these ideas, these concepts, many of them borrowed from the British, who were of course the world's greatest imperial power, an empire in which literally the sun never set. Americans were beginning to find a way to make themselves more comfortable with the idea of overseas expansion, this thing that we'd always been ambivalent about, indifferent to, hostile to, until the end of our frontier and our growing overseas trade made it increasingly important for America to look out for itself in the world and to ensure its access to markets, ensure its ability to spread its ideological gospel, if you will. And so the tide's beginning to spin here. Hawaii was sort of a tipping point, and not long after that, we are going to sort of fall all the way over, if you will. And that is going to come courtesy of events very close to home, and namely a war in Spain, with Spain, over the island of Cuba, So Cuba is one of the oldest of the Spanish colonies in the Western Hemisphere. By the time you get to the 1890s, there's not much of that Spanish Empire left. The Spaniards used to have almost all of Central and South America and half of North America, and they have lost it and lost more and more of it as time goes by. Spain, as a European power, is relatively weak, and it's only got a handful of colonies left. It's got the Philippine Islands and the island of Guam in the Pacific, and it's got the islands of Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. And the jewel in the crown in the Caribbean, of course, was Cuba. It's a large island and with a large population. The Spanish have had it for more than 400 years, but as the Spaniards had done everywhere where they colonized, they had set up a caste system, so that the Spaniards and the descendants of Spanish colonials were at the top of the social and economic ladder. They held all the economic and political power, and the native peoples, or the descendants of the native peoples, had very few rights, had very few economic opportunities, and the rule of the Spanish authorities was very, very harsh. The principal crop of Cuba was sugarcane, and the principal market for that sugarcane was the United States. But when the Panic of 1893 showed up and America fell into that depression at the beginning of Grover Cleveland's second term, one of the things that American businessmen prevailed upon the president to do to protect American industry was throw up trade barriers to the importation of foreign commodities. And one of the trade barriers we threw up was against Spanish sugar coming from Cuba, and that was done to protect the American sugar industry. And of course, that had a devastating impact on the Cuban economy and worsened what was already a tenuous situation between the Spanish upper class and the vastly larger Cuban underclass, which had periodically rebelled in search of freedom or better rights, and had always failed. There had been a revolt in 1895, and the Spaniards had put it down with great brutality, and the United States had looked the other way, hadn't really cared about it. But this time, things are going to, a rebellion had been 1865, 1878. In 1895, a new rebellion breaks out, and this time the Americans are going to pay attention to it. We're going to pay attention to it for several reasons. First off, that early rebellion from 1868 to 1878, that was right after our Civil War. We were in the full throes of Reconstruction and finishing the settlement of the West, so we were self-absorbed. We really, didn't think much about the rest of the outside world, and the census hadn't happened, and Turner hadn't happened, and Mahan hadn't happened. Well, then you get into the 1890s, and the West is settled. That depression is gone. We've discovered gold in Alaska, which has helped us get out of that depression. The Second Industrial Revolution is well on the way to having worked its magic in America. And basically, we have the ability, the time, to look outside our own issues at the larger world. We have a new president, William McKinley, who's come into office, and so we've ushered in an era of Republican dominance that's going to hang with us for a while. So America was more predisposed, if you will, to pay attention to what's going on in the rest of the world than we had been before. And one of the things that's going to help us pay attention to what's going on in the rest of the world was a change in journalism, So newspapers, of course, had always been the primary way that Americans got their news. But with the advent of the telegraph, with the evolution of the railroads, the invention of the telephone, news traveled faster than ever before. And so it used to be that when people read in their newspaper, unless it was a very local event, they were reading about things that maybe happened a month or more ago. And then by the time that you get to the Civil War, it was a few days or a week ago. But now you're at a point to where you're really reading about things that maybe happened yesterday. And you had also had, courtesy of the Second Industrial Revolution, the invention of the rotary press. And the rotary press vastly sped up the printing process, and it made it cheaper at the same time. So now it was possible to not only gather the news quicker than ever and to disseminate the news quicker than ever by railway and this sort of stuff. You could get those papers out there very fast, and you could spread them very widely. It was also now cheaper to print those papers, so that newspapers now began to make their money mostly through advertising. There'd always been advertising in newspapers, but the primary way that a paper had made its money was to sell subscriptions, to actually sell the paper. But now you can sell a paper for a penny or two, and almost anybody can afford to buy a paper. Most Americans are now literate, so you've vastly expanded your market, and it makes sense to want to sell things to people as cheaply as possible so that they can consume it. And so the business of media is born that you still have today. Why are all those commercials on the radio and on TV and all those ads on websites and in newspapers? Because that's how the website, the newspaper, the TV station makes their money. They don't charge you necessarily for it to the extent that they would have to. They're basically selling your eyeball. They're selling your eyeball. If a newspaper had a circulation of 1,000 people, somebody might be willing to put an ad in there, but they're probably not going to pay very much for that. If your newspaper has a circulation of 1 million people, well, someone's definitely going to want to put their ad in your paper, and they're going to be willing to pay a great deal for it, right? So the way that newspapers made their money was through advertising, and the higher their subscription rate and their circulation rates, the more money they could charge advertisers. And the trick to this, of course, is to have the kind of stories that people cannot resist, to have those dramatic headlines that people cannot turn away from. And that means that you get a new style of journalism, and during this period it was called yellow journalism. Yellow journalism. Historians argue about where the phrase comes from. Some people say, well, the paper was so cheap that it yellowed in the sun very quickly, and that's where it came from. And there are other theories, but for our purposes, all that we need to know is that yellow journalism was the sensationalistic reporting of the news. It was the sensationalistic reporting of the news. It's the difference between a headline that says plane crashes at airport and a headline that says dozens die in fiery crash. The same story is the same event, but one of those headlines is more apt to grab your attention than the other, right? And yellow journalism was very much in the business of sensationalizing the news, and where necessary, it was in the business of basically adding to the news. Not just writing it in a sensational way, but if we needed to, make the story juicier, if we needed to throw in some supposition or some implications or something like that, then we're going to juice it. We're going to make it more exciting, and we're going to make it more compelling. And so you could argue that there was falsehood that was being woven into the news, half-truths that were being put into the conclusions that were being jumped to, and descriptions that were being added that maybe were not wholly objective, and certainly the more outlandish, the more outrageous the story could be, the more it could work on people's emotions, then the more stories people wanted to read, and the more papers you were going to sell, and the more the newspaper printers and the newspaper companies could charge the advertisers. And for newspapers, of course, one of the problems is that not every story can be turned into something juicy and dramatic and compelling. Natural disasters, crime, electoral politics, scandal, corruption, yes, but you can't rely on them for extended periods of time, and you can't count on them showing up routinely. But one of the best stories that a newspaper can have is a war. Wars are dramatic. Wars are questions of life and death, of policy and profound issues, and wars are full of drama and tragedy and heroism and villainy. They make for extremely compelling reading. Extremely compelling reading. And of course, the other thing about most wars is that they go on for very long periods of time. So from a newspaperman's perspective, they're a story that gives and gives and gives and gives, and therefore will sell and sell and sell subscriptions and sell papers, and therefore bring in more and more advertising revenue. Of course, part of this is that the newspapers in the day were also very, very competitive. Almost every big city had at least 2 newspapers, unlike today where most cities only have 1. And these newspapers were fierce competitors, and the dominant papers in the country were in New York City, where you had Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal, and they were in a very competitive contest with each other for circulation, and they both wanted dramatic stories to write about. And a war in Cuba where the oppressed native peoples were struggling for their independence against these nasty colonial Spanish overlords, was the perfect kind of story. And the Cuban rebels, or insurrectos if you prefer, were of course aware of the way the newspaper business in the United States had evolved, and they fully intended to take advantage of it, so they sent representatives to New York City to plead their case, to tell the story of Spanish oppression and the noble and gallant fight of the Cuban people for their freedom and independence, and Americans were captivated by this. They sucked it up. The Spanish did themselves no favor by having very oppressive policies that appalled Americans, and one of the most impressive of these policies revolved around the Spanish effort to defeat the Cubans, who were not waging a conventional war. The Cuban rebels didn't have formal organized armies. They couldn't stand up to the Spanish on a conventional battlefield, so they were fighting a guerrilla war. They were fighting a guerrilla war. A guerrilla war on a mountainous, jungle-covered island was a very difficult thing for the Spaniards to put down because your enemy didn't wear a uniform. He was the innocent farmer by day, and by night he took out his gun and he would attack Spanish troops and Spanish interest, and that's a very difficult kind of war to win. And the Spanish had always dealt with this kind of combat by being extremely harsh. Those tactics would be effective if they were allowed to play out over enough time. And so the Spanish would have brought out the old playbook in the new rebellion of the second half of the 1890s. They had 200,000 troops in Cuba, and they were practicing a policy of scorched earth. And so basically, if the guerrillas hide amongst the peaceful civilian population, then what you need to do is separate the peaceful civilian population from the guerrillas. So what the Spaniards would do is to institute what was called a reconcentration policy. They would go out into the countryside, they would literally fence it off with barbed wire and military outposts, and they would go into a sector and they would force all the civilians to leave it. And they would reconcentrate them, so literally a reconcentration of a population, in camps close to the cities. And of course, the Spanish military could control the cities. And then anybody who did not come in to the camps, who was still out there in these cleared sectors, would be considered guerrillas, and they could be shot on sight. You didn't have to catch them in the act of, of making an attack or plotting an attack or something like that. And of course, the difficulty in all of this is that you were taking people that didn't have very much. You're taking them away from what little they had, from their land, their livestock. These camps were overcrowded. Hygiene was very bad. There were a lot of indignities. You get people crammed together in this kind of environment. There's going to be a lot of sickness and disease, and so there was a lot of suffering. Hearst, New York Journal, and Pulitzer's New York World, we had reporters down there, and they played this stuff up. They played this stuff up and created an enormous amount of sympathy. For the Cuban people. And how did the U.S. government deal with it? Well, in the second half of the Cleveland administration, it didn't really deal with it at all. It had its hands full fighting the Panic of 1893. But in 1896, the Congress did pass a resolution favoring recognition of Cuban belligerency, which means the United States was going to recognize that the Cuban rebels were fighting a legitimate war, and therefore they were entitled to all of the benefits of the laws of war and the rules of war, and Americans could loan them money, they could sell them arms and munitions and medical supplies and this sort of stuff. This was a little bit too far for Cleveland, who was afraid that that would suck the United States into this war. But rather than simply ignore it, what he did is offered to mediate. He offered to mediate. The U.S. would be the honest broker. We'd help the Cuban rebels and the Spanish government sort of work things out. And of course, Spain didn't like that, and they declined. And then in 1896, you elected William McKinley, the last veteran of the Civil War, to become president. He took office in March of 1897. And like Cleveland, he didn't want to get the U.S. involved in this war. And McKinley had seen a war. He'd been right there on the firing line. He remembered its horrors all too well. He favored neutrality by the United States, just like Cleveland did. But he was more sympathetic to the cause of the Cubans. And he was smart enough to see where public opinion was going, but he needed time to develop a policy. And so he sent an aide on a fact-finding mission. I'm not just going to take the yellow journalists at their word. I know that they're sensationalizing things. They're padding their stories, and that you go down there and find out what's really going on. And so the aides went down there. They looked into it. They came back. And they basically told McKinley, hey, look, yes, the yellow press is playing this up for everything it's worth, but the gist of what they're reporting is true. The Spanish are acting in, quote, an uncivilized and inhumane way. Their war should be fought in a humane fashion. They're unnecessarily being cruel to the civilian population. And so now McKinley kind of had an answer, and he was expected to do something. And so what he did was to publicly come out and say that the Spanish are violating the rules of war and that they need to fight their war in a humane fashion. Now, of course, that made Spain angry. This was their territory. They had owned it for 400 years. Who was the United States to poke its nose in this business? And plus, the Spanish were probably willing to point out American hypocrisy and argue that we had hardly fought our Civil War in a humane fashion. Look at Sherman's March to the Sea, for example, and we'd hardly fought our Indian Wars in a humane fashion. But nonetheless, there was a fear that what McKinley was doing was maneuvering to find an excuse to intervene in the war. That the Americans were having an official policy here that was opening the door for American intervention. And the Spanish government in Madrid recognized that it could not afford to provoke the United States. The U.S. was bigger in terms of population, in terms of wealth, in terms of industrial power. It was, of course, much closer to Cuba than Spain, which is on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. And so the Spanish government talked about making concessions. They recalled the general who had instituted the reconcentration camp policy. They began to talk about offering some form of autonomy to Cuba. They declared an amnesty for political prisoners, and this gave the American people hope that this thing was going to turn out in a way that Americans liked. Now, the problem was that the Spanish government really didn't intend to do much different. The Spanish actually were just trying to tell the Americans what they wanted to hear and let the Americans be satisfied, and then the Americans would become distracted by something else, and Spain could conduct the war the way that it was used to conducting the war. But what this basically means is that the Spanish were telling a lie, and for that lie to be believable, it had to be believed by everybody, not just the American people, the American government, the American press. It had to be believable to the whole world, which meant it also had to be believable in Cuba, where the Spanish settlers who had been on that island for hundreds of years did not like what their government was talking about. And so in January of 1898, they showed their displeasure by rioting. This was orchestrated by Spanish officers in Cuba who led riots in Havana against the autonomy plan that the Spanish government in Madrid had been talking about. And for the Americans, this made them very nervous. These riots, it was feared, were anti-American in nature. Well, in fact, they weren't. They were really aimed at sending a message not to Washington, D.C., but to Madrid. But in the first blush of reporting, which is usually wrong, the idea came across that American citizens and American property were in danger. And there were a lot of Americans who lived in Cuba. There was a lot of American business in Cuba, a lot of American investment in Cuba. And so to protect it, it was decided to send the battleship USS Maine to Havana as a show of force. It was a friendly port visit officially, but everybody understood what was really going on. We were rattling the saber and reminding the Spaniards, you had better not bother Americans. Well, while the Maine was on its way there, an American ambassador to Cuba, you got a better handle on the situation. He said, hey, look, in fact, the mob stayed away from the Americans. They were very careful to leave Americans alone. And of course they were. They didn't want to give the U.S. an excuse to intervene in this war. But radio hasn't been invented yet, and so there was no way to recall the Maine. And she sailed into Havana Harbor, and she dropped her anchor. And the Spaniards were correct and polite, but they weren't happy to see an American battleship there, and they sort of anchored her in out-of-the-way place. But things calmed down briefly. The riots ended. The Maine was slated to leave very soon because she was supposed to go to New Orleans for Mardi Gras, so it made sense for her to stay until it was time to depart. But tensions began to get worse again very quickly when on February 9th of 1898, the New York Journal published a letter that had been obtained illegally from the Spanish ambassador to the United States, or from the Spanish ambassador to the United States, Enrique de Loma. This was a private letter written to a friend and entrusted to a diplomatic pal, so there's no way it could have been ethically obtained, but that didn't matter because what the letter said was explosive. And in this private piece of correspondence that the journal published and American people read, de Loma belittled the United States and President McKinley, calling the president weak and a would-be politician who was bidding for the admiration of the mobs by his pronouncements regarding Spain. And of course, the president now believed that the Spaniards had not been negotiating in good faith. The American people were outraged about all of this, and they noted that the Spanish had responded to the Maine coming to Havana by sending one of their own battleships to New York, and so the Spanish government was very embarrassed by this. It withdrew its battleship from New York. De Loma resigned, apologies were made, but the breach of faith was there, and it was not going to be easily forgotten. Still, everything might have calmed down and smoothed over, if not for an unfortunate incident that happened on the night of February 15th. That evening in Havana Harbor at 9:40 p.m., the battleship Maine blew up. It blew up. The ship was ripped in half. 266 American sailors and Marines were killed. And the reason for the Maine's destruction remained mysterious to this very day. It could have been an accidental explosion in the coal bunker. It could have been the result of sabotage. Nobody knew. Nobody has ever proven one way or the other. But certainly the yellow press went into overdrive on this, and they accused the Spanish of having destroyed the Maine deliberately. Now, President McKinley, was going to be careful, and he sent the Navy sent a team down there to investigate, and the investigation would come to a conclusion, and hopefully it would not be a conclusion that the United States had been deliberately attacked by the Spanish, but in case that had been what happened, the president felt that he had to prepare the United States for war in the event of war breaking out. So in March of 1898, he asked the Congress for an emergency $50 million emergency defense appropriation. Congress quickly complied by unanimous vote. That shook the Spaniards, who now believed that the United States was looking for an excuse to become involved in the war in Spain. And so the tensions between the two countries began to rise. At the end of March, March, the Navy investigatory team came back and said that they believed that the Maine had been deliberately sunk by an underwater mine remotely detonated from on shore. And although that conclusion has been called into question since, at the time, this is what your naval experts were saying. And this, of course, fit in with what a lot of Americans believed about the Spanish and their war in Cuba, that they were unscrupulous, they were duplicitous, they were cruel. And this is just exactly the sort of thing that they would do. Of course, in retrospect, it doesn't make any sense. They didn't want the U.S. to become involved. What better way to do that than to attack an American warship? But perception, again, being reality. The American people have just been told by the Navy that the Maine had been deliberately destroyed. And the Navy didn't say who did it. It didn't have to. Everybody understood, that must be the Spanish. And so remember the Maine became the battle cry of the American press. The American people were outraged. They demanded justice. They demanded revenge. And pressure for war now became almost unbearable. McKinley still wanted to avoid it. And so on March 27, 1898, he sent a set of formal demands to Spain. If Spain wants to avoid a war, these are things that the Spanish are going to have to do. And the first of these is an immediate armistice in Cuba, a cessation to hostilities, a permanent cessation to hostilities. The reconcentration camp policy has to be abandoned, and then you must move explicitly toward recognizing Cuban independence. Spain countered with an offer to suspend hostilities, not a permanent cessation. They did shut down the reconcentration camps, but they said nothing about the call for Cuban independence. In other words, the Spanish did not meet McKinley's demands, and in the aftermath of the destruction of the Maine and the belief that the Spanish had done that, with the pressure for war from the American people, bearing down on him, McKinley now felt that he had no other choice. On April 22nd of 1898, he asked Congress to declare war on the Spanish Empire. On April 19th, the Congress, in a joint resolution, declared Cuba independent. Cuba didn't declare its own independence. The U.S. declared Cuba's independence for it. And having declared Cuba independent, the Congress authorized the president to use military force to expel the Spanish from Cuba if necessary. Unless anyone think that the U.S. was doing this for selfish reasons, in the Teller Amendment, we promised that the U.S. had no desire to annex Cuba whatsoever. Of course, the U.S. declaring a Cuban colonial possession more than 400 years old to be independent was something that the Spanish government simply could not accept. On April 22nd of 1898, Spain severed diplomatic relations with the United States, and the next day, the U.S. declared a blockade of Cuba, and the president called for 125,000 volunteers to augment the regular army for the war that everyone now knew was inevitable. And that war became official on April 25th of 1898 when the U.S. declared war on the Spanish Empire. And this was only the third declared war in American history, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, and now the Spanish-American War. And so the U.S. has suddenly found itself in a war with a European power for the first time since 1815. It is a war that we are fighting for what we believe to be just and noble cause, to revenge the Maine, to avenge the Maine, to help free the Cuban people from oppressive colonial rule. We are not doing this to gain a colony. We are not doing this to gain new territory. We are going to fight against wrong, and we are going to fight for what is right. And so there is war, and this war, which has been entered into for these righteous and noble reasons, is going to completely change American attitudes toward overseas expansion. We're going to go into this war holding only a small amount of overseas territory beyond the continental U.S., Alaska, Midway, and with concessions in Hawaii and Samoa. When we come out of it, the U.S. is going to have colonies stretching across the entire Pacific, and it is going to be on the path to becoming a world power. And so this is where we are going to stop. So this is the end of part 1 of this lecture. There will be another one that will go up on Thursday that will finish chapter 21. So I'm going to ask you not 5 questions, I'm going to ask you 3, and then the next lecture will have 2. Okay, and these are part of your first test. So the first of 3 questions for this video: what was the name of the historian who wrote the frontier thesis of American history? What was the name of the historian who wrote the frontier thesis of American history? Okay. Question number 2, Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote a book arguing that the United States had to have a new modern navy with a mission to control the seas. Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan wrote a book saying that the U.S. needed to develop a new modern navy with the mission of controlling the seas. What was the name of that book? What was the name of that book? And question number 3, what was the term used to describe the sensationalistic reporting of the news that helped to lead to the Spanish-American War? What was the term used to describe the style of news reporting that helped to provoke the Spanish-American War? So those are 3 questions for this lecture. We will have part 2 of this lecture. We will fight the Spanish-American War. We'll see what its consequences are. Then we'll go on to get the United States involved in China in something called the Boxer Rebellion and complete our rise as an imperial and world power. That will be the finish for our lectures on this section of the class. So in the next lecture, we have a couple of wars to fight, a chapter to finish up, and 2 questions for you to answer. Remember, if you have questions, you can always email me, and I will be happy to talk to you about the material, the upcoming test, or anything like that. And I will look forward to seeing you on your computer screen very soon.